Sometimes the quietest person in a crowded hallway is the one everyone will remember later. Though on that gray Monday morning no one at Westbridge High seemed to notice Naomi Carter except the boy who had decided she didn't belong. The bell had just rung, the kind of sharp metallic sound that echoed through lockers and polished floors, and students moved in waves toward their classes carrying backpacks, water bottles, and half-finished conversations about football games and weekend plans. But near the center of the hallway the current slowed because Ethan Walker had planted himself there like he owned the building. Ethan was the kind of student teachers described carefully and other students described honestly. Tall, confident, surrounded by friends who laughed a little too loudly whenever he spoke. His father's name was printed on the bronze plaque near the gymnasium doors as one of the school's biggest donors, and that fact floated around Ethan like an invisible shield. Naomi Carter stepped into that hallway quietly, adjusting the strap of a worn navy backpack that had clearly seen more bus rides than car rides. Her dark curls pulled back beneath a simple gray hoodie, her eyes steady but careful as she navigated a place that still felt unfamiliar. She had only been at Westbridge High for 3 days, and already she understood the invisible map of the school. Which tables in the cafeteria belonged to athletes, which corners belonged to theater kids, which hallways you walked quickly through if you wanted to avoid attention. Naomi preferred the edges of rooms, the quiet spaces where people rarely looked twice. Unfortunately for her, that morning Ethan Walker noticed. "Hey," he called, his voice cutting through the hallway noise with casual authority, and several students instinctively slowed their steps, because when Ethan spoke, people tended to watch. Naomi paused, turning slightly, her expression calm in the way someone looks when they are deciding whether a moment will matter later. Ethan tilted his head, as if examining something unusual. "You're the new girl, right?" he said, though his tone suggested the question didn't really require an answer. A couple of his friends leaned against nearby lockers, arms folded, waiting for whatever entertainment usually followed. Naomi nodded once, polite and quiet. Naomi Carter. The name settled into the space between them for a moment, simple and steady. Ethan gave a short laugh that didn't sound particularly amused. "Funny," he said, glancing around as if sharing the observation with the crowd that had slowly formed without anyone admitting they had stopped walking. "I don't remember seeing you around here before. Westbridge usually gets students who fit." The last word lingered just long enough to make the meaning clear without needing explanation. Naomi felt the familiar sensation of being studied, the weight of assumptions people sometimes carried before learning anything real about her, but she didn't lower her gaze. The fluorescent lights above flickered softly against the polished floor, reflecting a line of lockers stretching toward the cafeteria doors, and for a moment the hallway seemed unusually still. "I'm just here to go to school," Naomi said evenly, her voice calm enough that it surprised a few of the students listening nearby. Ethan raised his eyebrows as if the answer itself were unexpected. He stepped slightly to the side, but not enough to open the path completely, his shadow crossing the tiles between them. "Well," he replied slowly, glancing at the quiet girl in front of him as though trying to place a puzzle piece that didn't match his picture of the school. "We'll see how long that works out for you." Around them the hallway noise began to return, footsteps echoing again as students hurried to class, but a few people looked back over their shoulders, sensing that something about the girl who had just walked past Ethan Walker without raising her voice might eventually turn out to be more important than anyone realized. Naomi adjusted her backpack again and continued down the corridor toward first period, unaware that this ordinary walk through a crowded American high school hallway had just started a chain of moments that would soon reach far beyond the walls of Westbridge High. By the time Naomi Carter reached her first class that morning, the rhythm of Westbridge High had already settled into its usual routine, the low murmur of conversation blending with the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional squeak of sneakers against polished floors. Yet Naomi still felt the quiet awareness that comes with being new in a place where everyone else already understands the invisible rules. Room 214 smelled faintly of dry erase markers and freshly printed worksheets, the familiar scent of American classrooms where the day usually begins with attendance and a reminder about homework. Naomi chose a desk near the window, not because anyone told her to, but because it allowed her to see a slice of sky between the football field lights outside, a pale blue stretch that reminded her the world was always larger than whatever hallway conversation happened to unfold inside a school building. She placed her backpack gently on the floor beside the desk, smoothing the edge of a notebook that had been carefully labeled in neat handwriting. Naomi had always believed that order made difficult days easier to carry. As students filled the room in small clusters, she noticed the subtle glances that new students often receive, the quick looks followed by whispered guesses about where she might have transferred from. Some of those glances carried curiosity, some carried indifference, and a few carried the quiet judgment that Naomi had already learned to recognize without reacting to it. Across the room, two girls compared schedules while a group of boys argued about the upcoming Friday night football game, their voices animated with the kind of easy confidence that comes from growing up together in the same town. Naomi listened without trying to join in, absorbing the details the way careful observers often do when entering unfamiliar spaces. The teacher, Mrs. Delgado, stepped inside a moment later with a stack of papers balanced against her hip and the warm, but focused expression of someone who had spent many years guiding teenagers through the ordinary chaos of high school life. She greeted the class with the steady tone of someone who believed every student deserved to start the day with respect. When her eyes reached Naomi, she paused for a moment in recognition. "You must be Naomi Carter," she said kindly, her voice carrying the calm assurance that sometimes makes a new student feel less alone in a crowded room. Naomi nodded once, standing briefly out of habit. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Delgado smiled gently and gestured for her to sit again. "Welcome to Westbridge High. We are glad you are here." The words were simple, but Naomi appreciated them more than the teacher realized. A few nearby students looked up again with renewed curiosity, though most quickly returned to their phones or conversations. Naomi opened her notebook and began writing the date in the corner of the page, the small act grounding her in the present moment. From the hallway outside came the fading echo of footsteps and lockers closing as the late bell rang, sealing the classroom into that quiet bubble where lessons and expectations replaced hallway dynamics for the next 50 minutes. Yet Naomi knew that the real atmosphere of a school was not defined by textbooks or whiteboards, but by the relationships forming quietly between people who did not always understand one another. She remembered the brief exchange earlier that morning and the way Ethan Walker had studied her as though she were a question he had not decided how to answer yet. Naomi had seen that kind of look before in other schools and other towns, a mixture of curiosity and assumption that sometimes followed her long before anyone learned her story. But Naomi Carter carried herself with the calm patience of someone who had learned that time reveals far more than arguments ever could. As Mrs. Delgado began explaining the semester's reading list and the importance of critical thinking, Naomi listened carefully, her attention steady, her posture relaxed. Outside the window, the wind moved lightly across the football field, bending the tall grass along the fence line in slow waves. For most students in that room, the day felt perfectly ordinary, just another Monday in a familiar building. For Naomi Carter, it was the beginning of something she could sense but not yet see, a quiet shift in the rhythm of a place that had not yet realized how much it was about to learn about the girl sitting calmly by the window. By the time the lunch bell echoed through Westbridge High that afternoon, the building had shifted into its second rhythm of the day, the louder, less structured energy that filled hallways when classes paused and hundreds of students suddenly moved toward the cafeteria at once. Naomi Carter stepped out of room 214 with her notebook tucked neatly inside her backpack, blending quietly into the current of students walking toward the center of the school. The air carried the familiar mix of cafeteria pizza, detergent from freshly cleaned floors, and the distant scent of cut grass drifting in through the open side doors that faced the football field. Naomi walked calmly, her pace steady, her eyes observing more than speaking, because she had always believed that the first week in a new place was not for proving anything, but for understanding the environment. Around her, the voices of students rose and fell like waves, conversations about math tests, practice schedules, and weekend plans filling the space in a way that made the building feel alive. Yet there was one voice that always seemed to travel farther than the others. Ethan Walker stood near the vending machines just outside the cafeteria entrance, leaning casually against the wall as though the entire hallway had been designed for him to occupy. A group of friends surrounded him, laughing at something he had just said, their confidence shaped by years of shared history inside the same school district. Ethan had the relaxed posture of someone who had never needed to wonder whether he belonged somewhere. His jacket carried the embroidered logo of the Westbridge varsity football team, and the hallway lights reflected faintly off the polished glass of a trophy case beside him where championship plaques from previous seasons lined the shelves. For students walking past, Ethan was not simply another classmate. He was a center point in the social map of Westbridge High, the kind of presence people noticed automatically whether they wanted to or not. Naomi slowed slightly as she approached the cafeteria doors, not out of hesitation, but because the hallway had naturally narrowed where groups of students gathered. She could hear Ethan speaking clearly now, his voice confident and easy. "Coach says this season might be the best we have had in years," he said, tossing a football lightly between his hands before catching it again. His friends nodded with the casual agreement of people who expected success. As Naomi moved closer, Ethan's eyes shifted briefly across the hallway and settled on her again. It was the same measuring look from that morning, as if he were still trying to decide where she fit in a place that already had established patterns. Naomi did not stop walking. She simply adjusted the strap of her backpack and continued toward the cafeteria entrance, calm and steady, the way someone moves when they refuse to be pulled into someone else's expectations. Inside the cafeteria, the sound level rose instantly, trays sliding across counters, chairs scraping lightly against tile floors, and dozens of overlapping conversations filling the room with that unmistakable energy that belongs only to American high schools during lunch hour. Naomi chose a small table near the far windows where sunlight stretched across the floor in long bright lines. She opened her lunch container slowly, the simple meal she had prepared that morning resting beside a bottle of water. Through the glass, she could see the practice field where rows of metal bleachers faced the wide green grass that had hosted countless Friday night games. Naomi had learned something about places like Westbridge during the past few years. Schools often looked peaceful from the outside, with banners, trophies, and carefully trimmed lawns presenting a picture of pride and tradition. But inside those buildings were complicated stories that took time to unfold. Naomi Carter had come to Westbridge quietly, carrying little more than a backpack, a few notebooks, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was even when nobody else did. Across the cafeteria, Ethan Walker stepped through the doors with his friends, still laughing about something that had happened in practice earlier that week. His presence shifted the attention of nearby students almost automatically. Naomi noticed the movement, but did not look up immediately. She simply continued eating her lunch, calm and composed. Because sometimes the most powerful person in a crowded room is not the one making the most noise, but the one who already understands that time has a way of revealing truths no one expects at first glance. The cafeteria at Westbridge High gradually settled into the steady rhythm that always followed the first 10 minutes of lunch, when the rush for food had passed and students spread out across the room in clusters that reflected the quiet social structure of the school. Naomi Carter remained at her small table near the windows, the sunlight shifting slightly across the floor as clouds moved slowly outside above the football field. She finished the last bite of her lunch and closed the lid of her container with calm, careful movements that suggested she was used to taking care of her own things. Around her the room buzzed with conversation, trays clinking, soda machines humming softly against the far wall. Naomi could feel occasional glances drifting toward her from nearby tables, the kind of curious looks new students often receive, but she did not appear bothered by them. Instead, she rested her hands lightly on the table and watched the breeze ripple the tall grass beyond the practice field fence. Across the cafeteria, doors swung open again, and Ethan Walker entered with several friends, the sound of their laughter carrying easily above the room's background noise. Ethan moved with the easy confidence of someone who had walked through the same halls for years without ever feeling uncertain about his place there. A few students at nearby tables greeted him with nods or quick waves, and he returned them casually as he scanned the cafeteria. His eyes eventually landed on the far windows where Naomi sat alone. For a moment he studied her again, the same thoughtful look he had worn earlier that morning, as though he were still trying to understand why the quiet new student seemed so completely unaffected by the attention she was beginning to attract. Ethan said something to one of his friends, and then walked across the room toward the window tables. The movement caught the attention of a few students nearby, because people rarely approach Naomi's table during lunch. Naomi noticed the shift in motion before she looked up. When she did, Ethan was already standing beside the table with his hands resting lightly on the back of an empty chair. His expression was not openly hostile, but there was a challenge in the way he tilted his head slightly. "You sit over here by yourself every day," he said, his voice steady enough that several students at nearby tables could hear without him raising it. Naomi met his gaze calmly. "It is quiet here," she replied. Ethan glanced toward the wide windows and the practice field beyond them, as if evaluating the answer. One of his friends leaned casually against the nearby vending machine, watching with mild curiosity. "Most people try to find a group during lunch," Ethan continued. "Makes school easier." Naomi considered the comment for a moment before speaking again. "Sometimes people learn more by listening than by talking." The answer drew a brief, surprised look from one of the students nearby, but Naomi's tone remained gentle rather than confrontational. Ethan pulled the chair slightly away from the table, but did not sit down. "You talk like you already know this place," he said. Naomi shook her head once. "No, I just know people." The words were simple, but something about the calm certainty in her voice caused Ethan to pause longer than expected. The cafeteria noise continued around them, yet the space near the window felt momentarily quieter, as if the conversation carried a weight. The rest of the room had not fully noticed yet. Ethan straightened the chair again and rested his hands briefly on the table's edge before stepping back. "Well," he said after a moment, his tone lighter now though still curious, "Westbridge can surprise people sometimes." Naomi nodded slightly. "Every place can." Ethan studied her for another second, then gave a short shrug and turned toward his friends. As he walked away, the normal noise of the cafeteria seemed to flow back into the space he had occupied. Naomi watched the sunlight slide another inch across the floor and gathered her things calmly, unaware that several students who had overheard the exchange were already beginning to realize that the quiet girl by the window carried a kind of confidence that did not come from popularity or reputation, but from something deeper that Westbridge High had not yet discovered. The afternoon classes at Westbridge High moved slowly toward the final bell, the kind of steady passage of time that often made students glance repeatedly at the clock above the classroom door. Outside the windows, the sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting long bands of warm light across the football field and the parking lot beyond. Naomi Carter spent the last minutes of history class writing carefully in her notebook, while Mrs. Delgado's voice carried gently across the room, explaining an assignment that would be due at the end of the week. Naomi listened closely, her attention steady in the quiet way she approached most things. Around her, other students had already begun gathering their backpacks, the subtle sounds of zippers and shifting chairs signaling the approaching end of the school day. When the final bell finally rang, the hallway outside filled almost instantly with the familiar rush of footsteps, lockers opening and closing, and conversations spilling out into the corridors. Naomi placed her notebook neatly inside her bag and stood, adjusting the strap over her shoulder before stepping into the flow of students moving toward the exits. The late afternoon air waiting outside the building carried the mild warmth of early fall, somewhere near 70 degrees, the sky bright but softened by thin clouds drifting slowly above the town. Naomi moved calmly down the main hallway, passing rows of lockers and bulletin boards covered with announcements for sports tryouts, debate club meetings, and the upcoming homecoming dance. She had only been at Westbridge High for a few days, but she had already learned the quiet art of moving through crowded spaces without drawing attention. Still, attention sometimes finds people even when they do not seek it. As Naomi stepped through the double doors leading toward the courtyard walkway, she noticed a familiar voice again before she saw the person speaking. Ethan Walker stood near the base of the wide concrete steps outside the building, a football tucked under one arm as he talked with two teammates. The afternoon light outlined the tall oak trees surrounding the courtyard, their leaves shifting gently in the breeze that carried the distant sound of traffic from the road beyond the school grounds. Students scattered across the walkway in small groups, some heading toward parked cars while others waited near the curb for the yellow school buses lined up along the street. Naomi moved toward the path leading to the bus stop, her steps unhurried, her posture calm. As she passed the steps, Ethan noticed her again. His conversation paused mid-sentence as his eyes followed her movement across the courtyard. There was something about the way Naomi carried herself that continued to draw his attention, not because she tried to stand out, but because she seemed completely unaffected by the quiet social currents that guided most students through the school. Ethan stepped down from the concrete steps and walked a few paces in her direction, his teammates watching with mild curiosity. "You take the bus?" he asked, his tone casual but direct. Naomi turned slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she answered. Ethan glanced toward the line of buses waiting along the curb, engines humming softly as drivers prepared for departure. "Most people who transfer here do not stay long," he said, as though offering a simple observation rather than a warning. Naomi adjusted the strap of her backpack again. "Sometimes people leave places," she replied calmly, "but sometimes they arrive exactly where they are supposed to be." The words lingered between them for a moment, quiet but steady. Ethan studied her expression, perhaps expecting irritation or uncertainty, but finding neither. Around them the courtyard remained lively with the sounds of students ending their day, doors closing, laughter echoing briefly between the brick walls of the school. Ethan finally gave a small shrug, bouncing the football lightly once against his palm. "Well, he said after a moment, "Westbridge has its own way of doing things." Naomi nodded slightly. "Every place does." She then turned and continued walking toward the bus stop, where a small group of students had already gathered. The breeze moved gently through the courtyard trees, carrying the faint rustle of leaves across the pavement. Behind her, Ethan remained near the steps, watching for a moment longer than he intended before tossing the football back to his teammate. Something about the quiet girl with the steady voice had unsettled the easy certainty he usually carried through the halls of Westbridge High, though he could not yet explain why. Naomi climbed the bus steps a few minutes later and took a seat near the middle row, looking out the window as the engine vibrated softly beneath the floor. As the bus slowly pulled away from the curb and rolled past the football field, the late afternoon sun reflected off the wide glass windows of the school building behind her. For Naomi Carter, the first week at Westbridge High was still unfolding one quiet moment at a time, and none of the students in that courtyard yet understood how much the calm new girl riding the bus home each day was about to change the story they thought they already knew. The next morning arrived with a thin layer of fog drifting across the streets of Westbridge, the kind that softened the early sunlight and made the town feel quieter than usual. Naomi Carter stepped off the yellow school bus just after 8 o'clock, the cool morning air brushing lightly against her face as she adjusted the strap of her navy backpack and looked toward the wide brick building of Westbridge High. Students were already gathering near the entrance, some laughing, some scrolling through their phones, others leaning against the metal railings while waiting for friends to arrive. The sound of lockers opening inside the building carried faintly through the glass doors each time someone stepped through. Naomi walked calmly across the front walkway, her footsteps steady against the concrete path that led to the main entrance. The sky above had begun clearing, pale blue stretching across the horizon as the fog lifted slowly over the football field beyond the school parking lot. Inside the hallway, the familiar rhythm of the morning had already begun. Conversations echoed lightly between the rows of lockers while teachers greeted students moving toward their first period classes. Naomi slipped through the crowd quietly, nodding politely when a girl from her English class offered a small smile of recognition. Although she had only been at Westbridge for a few days, people had begun noticing the quiet new student who seemed calm in a place where most teenagers felt pressure to prove themselves. Naomi did not move with the nervous energy of someone trying to fit in. She carried herself with a quiet steadiness that came from knowing who she was long before she arrived at this school. As she reached her locker and turned the small metal dial, the hallway noise continued around her like a steady current. Somewhere down the corridor, a group of football players laughed loudly about practice drills from the previous afternoon. Naomi placed her history notebook carefully inside the locker and closed the door with a soft click. When she turned, she noticed Ethan Walker standing near the water fountain about 20 feet away, talking with two teammates while spinning a football slowly in his hands. The morning light from the high windows reflected off the polished floor between them. Ethan glanced up mid-conversation and saw her again. For a brief moment his expression shifted into that same thoughtful look Naomi had noticed before, the look of someone trying to understand a situation that did not behave the way he expected. Naomi gave a simple nod of acknowledgement and continued down the hallway toward her classroom. The day moved forward in quiet steps. During English class, Naomi answered a question about a novel the class had begun reading, her voice calm but confident enough that several students turned to look at her with new interest. Later in science lab, she carefully measured the temperature of a small beaker while her partner wrote down the numbers, the red line on the thermometer rising slowly as the experiment continued. The hours passed in the ordinary way that school days often do, but something subtle had begun shifting in the atmosphere around Naomi Carter. A few students now greeted her when they passed in the hallway. Others seemed curious about the calm girl who never rushed to speak, but always seemed prepared when she did. By the time lunch arrived again, the cafeteria buzzed with the usual noise of trays and conversations, yet Naomi still chose the same table near the windows. Outside the sky had turned bright and clear, the afternoon sun reflecting off the metal bleachers beside the practice field. Naomi rested her hands around her water bottle and watched the breeze move across the grass. For a moment the world seemed quiet despite the crowded room behind her. There was something peaceful about that stillness, the small pause in the middle of a busy day when thoughts could settle. Naomi Carter had learned to appreciate moments like that, because sometimes the calmest moments were simply the space before something unexpected arrived. The cafeteria noise swelled and faded in uneven waves as lunch continued at Westbridge High, the clatter of trays and quiet conversations filling the wide room, while sunlight poured through the tall windows beside Naomi Carter's table. Outside the glass, the football field stretched across nearly 100 yards of bright green grass, the white yard lines glowing softly beneath the afternoon sun. Naomi sat calmly near the window as she had every day that week, her lunch finished, her water bottle resting between her hands while she watched a few birds glide slowly above the empty bleachers. Inside the cafeteria, the usual groups occupied their familiar spaces, athletes near the center tables, theater students near the back wall, and smaller circles scattered between them. Yet on this afternoon something slightly different hung in the air, the subtle awareness that the quiet new girl had become a quiet topic of curiosity among students who had started noticing her steady presence. Across the room the cafeteria doors opened, and Ethan Walker entered again with two teammates, their conversation about football practice drifting easily through the room. Ethan carried the same relaxed confidence he always did, but when his eyes moved across the tables, they paused once more on Naomi, sitting by the window. For a moment, he seemed to consider walking past like usual, but something made him change direction. He stepped across the cafeteria floor until he stood a few feet from her table, resting his hands casually against the back of an empty chair. Several nearby students looked up, sensing the moment without fully understanding why. Naomi lifted her eyes from the window and met his gaze with the same calm expression she had shown since the first day. Ethan studied her for a second before speaking. "You know, people are starting to notice you," he said, his voice steady enough for the surrounding tables to hear without being loud. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Notice what?" Ethan glanced around the cafeteria, as if gesturing to the entire school environment. "You show up here. You keep to yourself. You talk like you have already seen everything before." His tone carried curiosity more than hostility now. Naomi thought about the question briefly before answering. "Maybe I just listen more than most people." Ethan gave a short laugh, though it sounded thoughtful rather than mocking. "You act like none of this matters." Naomi looked out the window for a moment before returning her gaze to him. "Some things matter," she said softly, "and some things only look important until time shows the truth." The words hung in the air longer than anyone expected. A few students at nearby tables had gone quiet, pretending to focus on their lunches while listening carefully. Ethan rested his hand briefly on the table, then noticed something small lying beside Naomi's water bottle. It was a thin silver chain with a simple pendant attached, the kind of necklace someone might tuck beneath a shirt most of the time. The pendant had slipped into view while Naomi moved her hands earlier. Ethan leaned slightly closer, curiosity pulling his attention toward the engraving on the small metal surface. Two letters were etched carefully into the silver, V and D. The initials were clear enough that he paused for a moment, his brow tightening slightly as recognition flickered across his expression. Naomi noticed his glance and gently lifted the necklace, holding it for a second before letting the pendant rest again against the table. "Family," she said simply, her voice calm. Ethan straightened slowly, the meaning of the initials settling somewhere in the back of his thoughts, even though he could not yet fully explain why they felt familiar. Around them, the cafeteria noise gradually returned as conversations resumed and trays slid across tables again. Ethan looked at Naomi one more time, his usual confidence replaced by a hint of quiet uncertainty. "You are different," he said finally. Naomi offered a small, patient smile. "Everyone is," she replied. Outside the window, the afternoon sunlight brightened across the football field as a breeze moved through the grass, and for the first time since Naomi Carter had arrived at Westbridge High, Ethan Walker began to suspect that the quiet girl sitting by the window carried a story far larger than the school had imagined. The afternoon after that quiet moment in the cafeteria carried a different feeling through the halls of Westbridge High, though most students could not yet explain why. Naomi Carter left the cafeteria with the same calm pace she always had, her backpack resting lightly on her shoulder as she walked through the corridor where sunlight from the tall windows stretched across the polished floor in long golden lines. Behind her, conversations slowly returned to normal, but several students who had seen the silver pendant or overheard the exchange with Ethan Walker continued whispering quietly as they moved toward their classes. Ethan remained near the cafeteria entrance for a moment longer than he expected, the two engraved letters on Naomi's necklace replaying in his thoughts. V and D. The initials felt familiar in a way he could not immediately place, like a name on the edge of memory. One of his teammates nudged his shoulder lightly. "You coming to practice later?" the teammate asked. Ethan blinked once and nodded automatically. "Yeah, I will be there." Yet his attention lingered elsewhere. The rest of the school day passed in the steady rhythm of lectures, homework reminders, and the distant sound of lockers closing between classes, but the small detail from lunch refused to leave Ethan's mind. During his final period, he stared briefly at his notebook without writing anything, his thoughts replaying Naomi's calm voice and the quiet confidence she carried even when people questioned her presence. When the last bell finally rang and students poured into the hallways again, the late afternoon sunlight had grown warmer, casting a soft orange glow across the parking lot outside. Naomi moved toward the front of the building where the school buses waited each day, her steps calm and unhurried as always. The breeze carried the faint scent of autumn leaves drifting from the row of oak trees lining the campus walkway. As she reached the bus line, Naomi paused for a moment and pulled the small silver pendant gently from beneath her hoodie, checking that the clasp had not loosened during the day. The metal caught the sunlight for a brief second, the engraved initials shining clearly before she tucked the necklace back inside her shirt. Across the courtyard, Ethan had stepped outside with his teammates on their way toward the practice field. He saw the motion without meaning to watch, his eyes catching the glint of the pendant again as Naomi adjusted it. This time the recognition struck more clearly. Ethan had seen those initials before, not on a necklace, but on something far larger. Posters in movie theaters, magazine covers in the grocery store checkout line, the bold signature used by one of the most recognizable actors in the country. Ethan slowed his steps as the thought formed completely. Vin Diesel. The realization felt almost ridiculous at first, the kind of idea someone might laugh about during lunch gossip. Yet the letters were unmistakable, and the calm way Naomi had described the pendant as family echoed in his mind with sudden clarity. He watched as Naomi stepped onto the bus, greeting the driver politely before walking down the aisle to her usual seat near the middle window. The bus engine rumbled softly as it prepared to leave, sunlight reflecting across the long row of yellow vehicles lined along the curb. Ethan remained standing near the walkway, the football tucked loosely beneath his arm as students passed around him. One of his teammates called his name from the direction of the field, but he barely heard it, because in that quiet moment a new understanding had begun to take shape. The quiet girl who arrived each morning on the school bus, who sat calmly by the cafeteria window and answered questions without fear, might be connected to a world far larger than Westbridge High had ever imagined. As the bus slowly pulled away from the curb and rolled down the street beyond the football field, Ethan watched it disappear past the tall oak trees at the edge of campus. For the first time since Naomi Carter had arrived at Westbridge High, he realized that the story unfolding around her was only beginning to reveal itself. The following morning, the sky above Westbridge carried the soft gray color of early autumn clouds, the kind that moved slowly across the horizon while the town awakened beneath them. Students gathered once again outside the front entrance of Westbridge High, their voices rising in scattered conversations while the yellow school buses arrived one by one along the curb. The wide brick building stood quiet and familiar, but a quiet tension lingered beneath the ordinary routine of the day. Ethan Walker arrived earlier than usual, the strap of his backpack hanging over one shoulder as he stood near the front walkway, looking toward the street. The memory of the silver pendant had not left his thoughts all evening. After practice the night before, he had searched the internet, curious about the initials he had seen. The result had appeared almost immediately. Those two letters were known across the country, stamped beneath movie posters and interviews for one of the most recognizable actors in Hollywood, Vin Diesel. The discovery had left Ethan staring at his phone screen in disbelief. At first he had assumed the connection must be coincidence. But the calm confidence Naomi carried, the way she spoke without hesitation, and the simple certainty in her voice when she said the necklace represented family had slowly erased that doubt. Now as Ethan waited near the school entrance, he watched the buses arrive one by one along the curb. Finally, the familiar yellow bus rolled slowly into place with a gentle hiss of air brakes. The folding door opened, and students stepped down in their usual morning rhythm. Naomi Carter appeared near the middle of the line, her dark hoodie pulled lightly around her shoulders as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The morning breeze moved softly through the oak trees beside the school, scattering a few brown leaves across the pavement. Naomi adjusted the strap of her backpack and began walking toward the entrance. She noticed Ethan standing nearby, his expression quieter than usual. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan took a small step forward. "I looked up those initials," he said honestly. Naomi studied his face for a second, then reached gently beneath her hoodie and lifted the silver pendant into the morning light again. The letters V and D glowed softly against the metal surface. "People usually do," she replied calmly. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, unsure how to continue. "Is it true?" he asked finally. Naomi held the pendant for a moment longer before letting it fall back against her shirt. "He adopted me when I was 8 years old," she said simply. The words carried no pride and no need to impress anyone. They were only the quiet truth of her life. Ethan looked down at the pavement, the realization settling fully now. All the assumptions he and others had made during Naomi's first days at school suddenly felt small and careless. He remembered the moment outside the bus earlier that week when his joke had made several students laugh. At the time it had seemed harmless, the kind of teasing that happened in every school hallway. Now it felt different. Naomi watched his expression carefully, but without anger. The breeze moved through the courtyard again, lifting a few more leaves along the edge of the sidewalk. After a moment, Ethan spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "I should not have talked to you that way before," he said. Naomi considered his words with calm patience. "People say things when they think they understand someone," she replied gently. "Sometimes they just need time to see more clearly." Ethan nodded slowly. For the first time he understood that Naomi had never needed to prove anything to anyone in this school. She had simply allowed people the space to reveal themselves. The morning bell rang from inside the building, echoing across the courtyard as students began moving toward the entrance. Naomi turned toward the doors, her steps calm as always. Before she reached them, she paused briefly and looked back toward Ethan. The smallest smile touched her face, not as a victory, but as quiet understanding. Then she continued inside with the rest of the students. Ethan remained standing beneath the oak trees for another moment, watching the doors close behind her as the hallway noise rose from inside the building. The school day would continue like any other day, yet something important had shifted in the silence between those moments. Because sometimes the strongest kind of power was not fame, wealth, or recognition. Sometimes it was the simple strength of a person who chose kindness even when the world expected something else.